In the heart of Harlem, one man rose from poverty to power. Frank Lucas, the self-made Heroin King of Harlem. His empire of money, power, and crime rewrote the rules of the drug world and challenged both the Mafia and the law itself. This is the untold story of how one man built an empire that shook New York to its core. In the deep rural stretch of LaGrange, North Carolina, during the Great Depression, a young boy named Frank Lucas was born into a world of poverty, racism, and limited hope. His childhood was defined not by opportunity, but by struggle. The kind of hardship that leaves a mark on a man's soul long before he learns what ambition even means. His father worked long hours at a logging company for almost nothing, while his mother tried to keep the family together with whatever scraps she could find. Frank grew up watching his family suffer, not because they lacked effort, but because the system was built to keep them poor. He often recalled the turning point that hardened his heart, witnessing his 12-year-old cousin murdered by the Ku Klux Klan, shot in cold blood for looking at a white woman. That memory never left him. It was more than a moment of violence, it was a lesson. A brutal education in how the world worked. From that day forward, Frank made himself a silent promise. He would never be powerless again. In those dusty streets of the segregated South, dreams of wealth or freedom felt like fiction. But Frank was different. He watched the world with sharp eyes. He studied the men who had power, the businessmen, the preachers, the white landowners, and realized that money was the only true language of respect. Poverty to him wasn't just a condition, it was a kind of imprisonment. And he was determined to break free. By the time he reached his teens, Lucas began hustling in small ways, stealing chickens, selling moonshine, and running minor scams. These weren't just acts of rebellion, they were steps toward survival. Each risk he took added to his understanding of people, how to read them, manipulate them, and outthink them. He knew that if he stayed in North Carolina, he'd either end up dead or working himself into the ground for pennies. The South had nothing left for him. So, one day, with nothing but a few dollars in his pocket and anger burning in his chest, Frank Lucas boarded a bus bound for New York City. He didn't know anyone there. He had no plan, no connections, no map to success. But he had one thing most men never have: a fierce refusal to accept his place in life. When he arrived in Harlem, he entered a different world. Loud, electric, alive with both danger and opportunity. It was the post-war 1940s, and Harlem was a vibrant mix of jazz, culture, and crime. On one side, there were churches, music clubs, and community leaders. On the other, there were hustlers, gamblers, pimps, and drug dealers, men who controlled the streets through fear and influence. Harlem had its own economy, its own rules, and its own kings, and Frank Lucas wanted to become one of them. At first, life in Harlem wasn't glamorous. Frank slept wherever he could, sometimes on benches, sometimes in cheap hotels. But every day, he studied the streets, the people, the flow of money, and the rhythm of power. He realized that in Harlem, the man with money was the man who made the rules. And those who didn't adapt were swallowed whole. He began working small, time jobs, first as a helper in clubs, then as a lookout for gamblers. He observed, he listened, and he learned. He wasn't reckless. He was strategic. While others wasted their cash on fast women and flashy cars, Lucas invested in relationships. He built trust with the right people and never showed desperation. He had the patience of a chess player waiting for the perfect move. It was during these early years that Frank began to understand something vital. Power wasn't just about violence. It was about control. Control over supply, over information, over loyalty. If you could control those three things, you could control Harlem. And control was exactly what he craved. He started dressing sharper, speaking smoother, moving with confidence. Even when he was broke, he acted like he wasn't. That confidence drew attention. People started to notice the young man from North Carolina who didn't act like he belonged at the bottom. Harlem was full of hustlers, But Frank had something different: discipline. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't use drugs. He was focused, almost obsessively, on building his empire, even before it existed. As months turned into years, his understanding of the city deepened. He learned who ran which blocks, which police officers could be bribed, and which neighborhoods held the highest profits. Harlem was a web of connections, and Lucas was learning to pull the strings quietly. But what truly separated him from the rest was his ability to see beyond Harlem. While most men were trapped in the small circle of their hustle, Frank was already dreaming about control on a national scale. He looked at the Italian Mafia, at the politicians who dined with criminals, and realized that power didn't come from the street. It came from owning the supply. And though he didn't yet know how, he began to imagine a future where he wouldn't just work under someone. He'd be the someone. In those early Harlem nights, under the flicker of neon lights and the hum of jazz spilling from club doors, the legend of Frank Lucas was quietly being born. Every handshake, every deal, every street corner he passed was part of his education. He was learning the language of survival, the rules of power, the price of loyalty, and the cost of ambition. And though no one knew it yet, the young boy from North Carolina was slowly becoming something Harlem had never seen before. A man destined to rewrite the city's criminal history. Harlem in the late 1940s wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a kingdom with its own hierarchy, its own code, and its own ruler. That ruler was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a man who balanced intellect and brutality with perfect precision. To the Harlem community, Bumpy was more than a gangster. He was a protector, a gentleman with power in his words and fear in his silence. He wore suits like a businessman, quoted poetry, and carried himself like royalty. Everyone in Harlem knew his name, and everyone respected it, including the police. When Frank Lucas first heard about Bumpy Johnson, he was still hustling small time on the streets, running errands, making deliveries, and watching how the underworld worked from the outside. But Bumpy's reputation fascinated him. Lucas saw something in Bumpy that reminded him of the control he craved, not just money, but respect. Bumpy wasn't a loud criminal. He was refined, disciplined, and calculating. He knew when to strike, when to talk, and when to disappear. Frank wanted to be like that. Not a common street thug, but a man of power with purpose. Their first meeting wasn't planned. Frank had been working for a small gambling operator who happened to owe money to Bumpy's organization. One night, during a tense collection, Frank's quick thinking and courage caught Bumpy's attention. Instead of running or freezing, Lucas stood firm, diffusing the situation before it turned violent. Bumpy noticed the young man's composure. He saw that Lucas wasn't ruled by fear, and that kind of composure was rare in Harlem's underworld. Soon after, Bumpy took him under his wing. What followed wasn't just mentorship, it was transformation. Frank Lucas wasn't being trained to hustle. He was being molded into a strategist. Bumpy began teaching him the deeper rules of the game, the psychology of power, the structure of crime, and the importance of image. You can't control a man by fear alone. Bumpy once told him, control him by debt, control him by loyalty, control him by respect, but never by fear alone. Under Bumpy's guidance, Frank learned how to carry himself like a businessman rather than a street hustler. He learned when to smile, when to stay silent, and when to make a statement. He learned that violence, when used, should be precise. Never sloppy, never emotional. Bumpy would often say, real power isn't loud, it's quiet. It's whisper that makes the room listen. For years, Lucas shadowed Bumpy through Harlem, from smoke-filled backrooms to lavish nightclubs. He watched as Bumpy balanced relationships with crooked politicians, police officers, and businessmen. Bumpy had influence everywhere, and yet he never lost control. Frank observed how Harlem's most powerful man managed to live between two worlds, the criminal underground and the high society that secretly funded it. During those long nights, Frank absorbed everything like a student. He learned the art of negotiation, how to handle betrayal, and the delicate politics of territory. He saw how Bumpy would lend money to struggling families, buy gifts for children, and pay for funerals. Gestures that bought him loyalty the police could never break. To Harlem's poor, Bumpy was both feared and loved. Lucas began to realize that power wasn't about how many men you could kill. It was about how many men would stand beside you when you didn't have to ask. Through Bumpy, Frank also saw the cracks in the system. He learned that most of Harlem's economy was being controlled by outsiders, mainly the Italian Mafia. They controlled the drug pipelines, the gambling circuits, and the distribution networks. Even Bumpy, as powerful as he was, had to answer to them. To Frank, that felt like a chain, invisible but real, and deep inside he began to imagine what it would take to break that chain. Bumpy trusted Frank because he was disciplined and silent. He didn't talk too much, didn't brag, didn't try to outshine his mentor. He listened. He studied. And slowly, Bumpy began giving him more responsibility, managing small gambling spots, collecting debts, organizing deliveries. Each task was a test, and Frank passed them all. He began to earn the kind of trust few ever received. Through those experiences, Frank's education in power became complete. He learned that loyalty was currency, silence was armor, and fear, when controlled, was the most effective weapon of all. He saw that Bumpy's real genius wasn't in how much money he made, but in how he commanded respect without losing his humanity. Even police captains would shake his hand when they saw him walking down 125th Street. He was Harlem's unofficial mayor, and Frank Lucas had the privilege of walking right beside him. But mentorship came with lessons that weren't always pleasant. Bumpy had enemies everywhere, rival gangs, mafia bosses, corrupt officers, and Lucas witnessed how quickly alliances could turn to betrayal. He saw friends become foes over a few dollars, and loyalty vanish in a second when greed entered the room. Harlem's power structure was fragile, and Frank was learning how to survive in it. Every conversation, every order, every glance was part of Bumpy's teaching. "Don't ever let them see you bleed," Bumpy would say. "The moment they know where you're weak, they own you." That advice sank deep into Frank's soul. It shaped the man he would become, calm, controlled, and emotionless when it mattered most. He wasn't learning crime, he was learning control. Over time, Lucas became more than a protégé. He became Bumpy's shadow. Wherever Bumpy went, Frank followed. He saw the deals that built empires and the betrayals that destroyed them. He watched Harlem bend to one man's will. And quietly, he began to believe that one day, he could command that same power. And as Harlem pulsed with life, crime, and ambition, a silent transformation was taking place. The young boy from North Carolina was evolving into something far greater, molded by a mentor who ruled the streets not by chaos, but by calculated strength. Frank Lucas was no longer just a hustler in the crowd. He was standing in the presence of power, learning how to build an empire of his own. One move at a time. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, Harlem lost its king, and Frank Lucas lost his mentor, his guide, and his shield. But for Frank, grief quickly transformed into determination. Standing in the crowd at Bumpy's funeral, surrounded by men who owed their lives to the fallen legend, Lucas made a silent vow he would take everything Bumpy had built and make it bigger, richer, and untouchable. Harlem was changing. The 1970s were coming fast, and the drug trade was exploding. The Mafia controlled the heroin supply, raking in millions, while Harlem's dealers got crumbs. Frank Lucas looked at that hierarchy and saw injustice. Not moral injustice, but financial injustice. He refused to accept that Harlem's own people had to beg permission from outsiders to profit off their own streets. He wanted independence. Total control. No middlemen. No bosses, no outsiders taking the biggest slice. To break free from the Mafia's control, Lucas needed something bold, something no one had ever attempted. He studied the supply chain from source to street and realized that every dealer in Harlem was being ripped off long before the heroin even touched American soil. By the time the product reached Harlem, it had passed through layers of smugglers, suppliers, and enforcers, each taking their cut. Frank Lucas understood a simple truth: if he could go straight to the source, he could own the game. The source, as he soon learned, was in the Golden Triangle, a rugged region of Southeast Asia where Thailand, Laos, and Burma met, known as the world's heroin capital. It was there that the purest, strongest heroin on the planet was produced, and it was also where most of the American supply originated during the Vietnam War. Frank Lucas didn't hesitate. With street smarts, fearlessness, and a flair for the unexpected, he flew to Bangkok under the guise of a businessman. He had never been out of the country, but he carried himself like a man who belonged anywhere he stood. In Thailand, he used charisma and money to build connections with local contacts, including a man named Leslie Ike Atkinson, a relative by marriage and an army sergeant with access to U.S. military transport routes. Atkinson became the key. Through him, Lucas met Southeast Asian suppliers directly, the warlords and jungle chemists who cooked the purest heroin known to the world. These men had never dealt with a black American before, let alone one who spoke with such authority and confidence. But Frank wasn't just a street hustler. He was a natural negotiator. He offered them something simple and irresistible: cash up front, and loyalty in return for purity and consistency. He cut out the Mafia entirely: no middlemen, no negotiations through Sicilian bosses. It was a radical move, one that shifted the balance of power in the drug world. For the first time, a black man from Harlem was importing heroin directly from the source, controlling his own product from jungle to block. The next step was distribution and secrecy. Lucas understood that power without protection was suicide, so he used military planes returning from Vietnam to smuggle heroin into the United States, hidden in the most unexpected places, inside false compartments of soldiers' caskets, according to urban legend, though Lucas later claimed it was in furniture shipments. Either way, his operation was genius. It was invisible, efficient, and incredibly profitable. When the heroin arrived in Harlem, it was so pure that it stunned the competition. Lucas branded it Blue Magic, a name that became legend in the streets. It was stronger than anything else out there, and it sold itself. Within months, Frank Lucas had built a distribution network that stretched across the East Coast. Dealers lined up to buy from him. Addicts swore by his product he had achieved what no other Harlem dealer had: a monopoly. And with that monopoly came wealth beyond imagination. Frank Lucas was making more than $1 million a day, a staggering sum for the time. He bought mansions in New Jersey, farms in North Carolina, and a fleet of luxury cars. He dressed in fine suits, but avoided the loud flashiness of other dealers. He preferred power that whispered rather than shouted. But what made his empire truly dangerous wasn't just money. It was organization. Lucas ran his operation like a corporation. Every person had a role, every move was calculated. His family members became his inner circle, trusted lieutenants who handled money, shipments, and street-level control. Loyalty wasn't optional, it was mandatory. Betrayal was dealt with swiftly and silently. Behind the glamour, though, Lucas's mind was always working, analyzing, adjusting, protecting. He knew the government was watching, and the Mafia was seething. By cutting them out, he had humiliated them. But he also knew that fear was his greatest protection. No one dared to cross him because they knew Frank Lucas wasn't reckless. He was surgical. He attended Harlem's finest clubs, rubbed shoulders with celebrities, and even sat front row at Muhammad Ali's fights. Yet behind that confident smile was a man running one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises America had ever seen. To the outside world, he was a successful businessman. To Harlem, he was a legend. And to law enforcement, he was a ghost. What started as one man's hunger for control had now evolved into a fully formed empire of power, money, and discipline. Frank Lucas had rewritten the rules of the drug trade. He was no longer the student, he was the teacher. No longer in the shadow of Bumpy Johnson, he was standing in the light of his own empire. And Harlem belonged to him. By the early 1970s, Frank Lucas was not just another name in Harlem. He was the name. His product, Blue Magic, had turned him into a myth whispered in alleys and shouted in nightclubs and feared in police briefings. His reach stretched far beyond New York. It pulsed through Philadelphia, Baltimore, Detroit, and Chicago. On every corner where heroin changed hands, someone was paying tribute to the man who had redefined the game. Harlem had never seen power like this. Power that moved silently but left earthquakes behind. Lucas had mastered what few ever could, the balance between luxury and invisibility. He knew that visibility brought danger, yet his ego couldn't resist showing the world who he'd become. The streets called him Superfly, but Frank saw himself as a businessman, not a street thug. "It's business," he would say calmly. "You run it right, you live like a king," and a king he was. In a Harlem dominated by chaos, Frank Lucas stood out for his order. His operation ran smoother than most legitimate corporations. Every member of his organization had a role, a routine, and a rulebook. He demanded discipline, no drugs, no public flash, no unnecessary violence. He paid his people well but kept them humble, reminding them that loyalty was their only true currency. His family handled the core operations, keeping outsiders at arm's length. It was an empire built on blood, trust, and fear, but polished with the precision of a Fortune 500 company. Money flowed faster than he could count it. Lucas claimed to have stashed millions in offshore banks, safe houses, and hidden vaults. Some nights he'd sit quietly in his New Jersey mansion, stacks of $100 bills piled high in front of him, counting not out of necessity but satisfaction. The boy from North Carolina, once sleeping on benches in Harlem, was now worth more than $50 million, a sum unthinkable for a black man in America at that time. But the money wasn't what made him dangerous. It was the respect. Even Mafia bosses who once looked down on him now met him with wary acknowledgement. They knew what Frank had done. He had taken their blueprint and perfected it. He had built a heroin empire bigger and cleaner than theirs, without needing a single Italian connection. That insult was unforgivable to the old guard. Yet they couldn't touch him. Frank Lucas had done the impossible. He had made Harlem independent. In public, his appearance became legendary. The moment that solidified his myth came in 1971 at Madison Square Garden during a Muhammad Ali fight. Dressed in a floor-length 100 Zalozan chinchilla fur coat with a matching hat, Frank sat front row, right beside celebrities, boxers, and businessmen. That coat became more than fashion. It was a symbol of dominance, of audacity, of victory. The photograph of Frank Lucas in that fur coat was seen by the world and by the federal agents who had been trying to put a name to the mysterious kingpin running Harlem. His lifestyle was the definition of excess. He owned a 300-acre ranch in North Carolina where he raised bulls, horses, and fighting dogs. In his driveway sat Rolls Royces, Cadillacs, and Mercedes-Benzes. His home was decorated with imported art, crystal chandeliers, and marble floors. He traveled with bodyguards, carried wads of $100 bills in custom, tailored suits, and dined like royalty. But beneath the glamour was a sharp mind, always working, always paranoid. Lucas understood that his empire stood on fragile ground. Every day, he demanded precision. Every shipment had to arrive on time. Every dollar had to be accounted for. Every street dealer had to follow his rules. He rewarded loyalty, but betrayal was unforgivable. "You steal from me," he once warned. "You're stealing from your family. And I don't forgive family who steal." Still, even as he built his fortress of discipline, temptation was everywhere. Money attracted attention, and attention attracted enemies. Rival dealers envied his control. Politicians wanted bribes. Crooked cops wanted their cut. Everyone wanted a piece of Frank Lucas's empire, but he refused to bend. He would rather burn money than share it. What made his reign extraordinary was not just the wealth, but how far his influence reached. Lucas quietly bought off police officers, city officials, and even politicians. In return, his operations ran smoothly. No one touched his shipments. No one questioned his sudden wealth. Harlem was his kingdom, and he ruled from the shadows, untouchable, unchallenged, and unseen. Even Hollywood stars and musicians wanted to meet him. His charm was magnetic. Unlike other crime lords, Frank didn't need to shout to command respect. He spoke softly, smiled rarely, and made promises he always kept. To his men, he was a provider. To Harlem, he was both a blessing and a curse. The man who brought prosperity to the ghetto and addiction to its soul. But as his legend grew, so did the noise. Reporters began whispering about a new power rising in the underworld. The DEA started connecting dots, trying to identify the mysterious source of blue magic. Competitors disappeared, and in the distance the faint hum of surveillance began closing in. Still, Frank Lucas walked with confidence, unbothered, unstoppable. He believed he was invincible, protected by wealth, loyalty, and the shadows of power. Each morning he looked in the mirror and saw not a criminal, but a man who had built an empire from nothing. A man who had outsmarted the Mafia, outplayed the police, and redefined what it meant to rule Harlem. For now, he stood at the summit, the Heroin King of Harlem, the face of money, power, and control. Every corner, every whisper, every dollar bore his name. And in that rare air of absolute dominance, Frank Lucas believed his empire would last forever. For years, Frank Lucas believed he had found the perfect formula for power. Control the product, control the streets, and control the people. His system was flawless. His loyalty was feared. His name commanded silence. But power, especially absolute power, has a way of making men believe they're untouchable. And that belief is where the fall always begins. By the mid-1970s, the glow of Harlem's underground empire had started to dim. The streets were drowning in addiction. Blue magic, the brand that had built Lucas's legend, was now destroying the very community that had once worshipped him. Violence rose, overdoses skyrocketed, and the city's attention turned toward the growing heroin epidemic. To the authorities, it wasn't just a street problem anymore. It was a national crisis. And somewhere at the top of that chain, hidden behind luxury and silence, was Frank Lucas. Lucas had always been careful, but success had bred arrogance. His rules, stay quiet, stay humble, stay invisible, began to fade. The lavish lifestyle he once controlled now drew eyes he couldn't avoid. The 100,000 chinchilla coat, the flashy cars, the front row seats at Ali's fights. They became breadcrumbs for law enforcement. What was once a symbol of victory became the very flag that marked his downfall. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, later merged into the DEA, had been watching Harlem for years. But Frank Lucas's empire had always been a ghost to them. Too clean, too quiet. It was Detective Richie Roberts, a straight, edged cop with a reputation for honesty, who began piecing together the puzzle. Roberts noticed something unusual, a new kind of heroin flooding the streets, purer, cheaper, and better than anything the Mafia could supply. Someone was outsmarting the entire system. Through surveillance, informants, and patient observation, Roberts and his team began mapping the connections. They followed the money, tracked the whispers, and slowly built the outline of a man who didn't fit any known profile. A businessman operating from the shadows of Harlem, running his empire like a corporation. Every lead, every rumor, every unexplained fortune pointed toward Frank Lucas. But before the law closed in, Lucas's greatest threat came from within. As his wealth grew, so did envy. Men who once praised him began plotting behind his back. Rivals who had been crushed by blue magic wanted revenge. Even some of his trusted lieutenants started cutting corners, diluting the product, pocketing profits. breaking the very code that held his empire together. The foundation of loyalty that Frank had built began to crack, not from force, but from greed. The streets started talking, and in the world Frank ruled, talk was poison. Meanwhile, the DEA intensified its pursuit. Undercover agents infiltrated his network, tracing money from Harlem to Southeast Asia. They began uncovering his operation piece by piece. The distribution routes, the hidden warehouses, the coded language used in phone calls. Wiretaps, surveillance photos, and financial records started to align into a single story. One man had outsmarted the Mafia and built a global drug empire. Frank Lucas had become too big to ignore. The turning point came in 1975. Federal agents executed Operation Bluestone, a large-scale raid targeting Lucas's properties. Before dawn, helicopters hovered over his Teaneck, New Jersey mansion. Dozens of agents stormed in, guns drawn. Inside, they found millions in cash, nearly 600,000 stuffed into bags, closets, and floorboards, along with jewels, documents, and evidence tying him to international drug trafficking. For the first time, the King of Harlem was cornered. The arrest sent shockwaves through the city. To Harlem's streets, it felt impossible. The man who seemed invincible taken down in one night. To law enforcement, it was a victory years in the making. And to Frank Lucas himself, it was the moment the illusion of control shattered. He had built an empire of discipline, secrecy, and loyalty. But in the end, it was human weakness that betrayed him. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered the full extent of his operations. The money trails, the offshore accounts, the smuggling routes from Thailand. Everything was exposed. The same meticulous organization that made him untouchable now became the evidence that sealed his fate. Every ledger, every phone number, every coded transaction told the story of an empire too precise to be innocent. In his cell, Frank Lucas was no longer the man in the mink coat. He was a name on a file, a number in a system he could no longer control. Yet, even behind bars, his legend continued to grow. Reporters called him the Black Godfather, the real American gangster, a man who had done what no one thought possible: outplay the Mafia at their own game. But inside, Frank knew the truth. He hadn't been defeated by the police or the Mafia. He'd been defeated by the very thing that had made him powerful. His belief that he was invincible. The streets whispered his name like a ghost story. His empire, once unstoppable, was now evidence sealed in boxes. The men who once swore loyalty to him disappeared. Some arrested, some hiding, some switching sides to save themselves. His wealth evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. And though the world saw his fall as justice in Harlem, his story became something different, a legend of brilliance, greed, and pride. Frank Lucas had climbed higher than any man from his world had ever dared. But at the peak of power, he had stopped listening to his own rules. The streets had once been his kingdom, now they were silent. The king had fallen, not with a gunshot, but with the quiet sound of handcuffs closing around his wrists. When the iron doors of his cell clanged shut, Frank Lucas found himself face to face with the weight of his own empire. The walls of his luxury mansion had been replaced by concrete, the sound of respect replaced by silence. The empire he had built brick by brick, deal by deal, had turned to dust in an instant. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. He sat there, the Heroin King of Harlem, stripped of power, fortune, and reputation. His mind raced through everything he had built: the connections in Southeast Asia, the loyal men on the streets, the money buried beneath houses and stashed in offshore accounts. Yet, none of it mattered now. The government had him. The media had named him. The streets had turned their backs. And worst of all, he was alone, facing a sentence that could have meant life behind bars. Frank Lucas knew he had two options: die as a legend of silence or live as a man who broke the code. The code of the streets had always been simple: you never talk. But Frank was not a street hustler anymore. He had seen too much, lost too much, and learned that in the game of survival, rules only matter when they work in your favor. So, when law enforcement offered a deal, cooperation in exchange for leniency, Frank Lucas did the unthinkable. He decided to talk. At first, it was disbelief. The authorities could hardly accept it. The man who once imported heroin through military planes, who had humiliated the Italian Mafia and built a billion-dollar operation, was now ready to cooperate. But this wasn't a simple confession. This was the opening of Pandora's box. Lucas didn't just have information about dealers. He had names, powerful names, corrupt cops, federal agents, politicians. He knew where the money flowed, how the drugs moved, and who looked the other way while Harlem drowned in addiction. With the help of Detective Richie Roberts, the same man who had taken him down, Frank became an informant. It was an unlikely partnership, the disciplined cop and the fallen kingpin, but both men saw opportunity in each other. For Roberts, it was a chance to clean the system. For Lucas, it was survival. Lucas's cooperation shook New York's law enforcement community to its core. He exposed the depth of corruption within the NYPD, naming more than 30 officers who had been taking bribes, stealing cash, or protecting dealers. Millions of dollars in dirty money were uncovered. Entire units were dismantled. The empire that once protected the drug trade from within was collapsing, and it was collapsing because of Frank Lucas's testimony. The same streets that had crowned him king now whispered a different name: snitch, traitor, rat. But Frank didn't care. He understood something most never did. Power doesn't come from loyalty, it comes from leverage. And right now, his information was leverage. It was his only currency left. Behind closed doors, the cooperation went even deeper. Lucas began helping agents map out the international drug routes from the jungles of Thailand to the docks of New York. He explained how heroin was smuggled in, how payments were made, and how the Mafia's old network had been replaced by his efficient military-style system. He became a living blueprint for dismantling one of the most powerful drug networks in American history. In exchange, his sentence was reduced drastically. What could have been life in prison was cut to just over 5 years. For many, that deal was a miracle. For others, it was betrayal at the highest level. Inside prison, word spread fast. The man who had once been untouchable now had enemies everywhere. Inmates whispered about him in the yard. Old allies plotted revenge. Every day was a test of nerves, not of strength, but of survival. But Frank had always been a survivor. He learned to move quietly, speak less, and watch everything. He was no longer the ruler of Harlem. He was a man learning to navigate the cage he had built for himself. When he was finally released, the world had changed. The streets no longer belonged to him. The heroin trade had evolved. His enemies were gone or dead, and the young generation barely remembered his name. But those who did, they remembered the legend and the betrayal. To some, he was the man who built Harlem's golden age of hustle. To others, he was the man who destroyed it to save himself. Yet, in his own mind, Frank never saw himself as a traitor. He saw himself as a businessman, one who adapted when the game changed. He had played by the street's rules when it served him. Now, he was playing by the system's rules. To him, both worlds were corrupt. The only difference was which one gave him the better deal. Over time, his cooperation helped dismantle a vast network of narcotics and corruption. More than 150 convictions were tied, directly or indirectly, to the information he provided. He helped expose one of the largest internal scandals in American law enforcement history. But the cost was his identity. The same voice that once commanded respect now carried the weight of betrayal. As the years passed, Frank Lucas's cooperation became both his redemption and his curse. It saved his life but erased his name from the code of the streets. The man who once walked Harlem as a legend now walked in silence. Surrounded by the ghosts of loyalty lost and power betrayed, he had rewritten his own legacy. Not as the ruthless kingpin or the fearless gangster, but as the man who broke every rule to stay alive. And for Frank Lucas, survival had always been the ultimate power. By the time the world had forgotten his name, Frank Lucas was no longer the man who once walked through Harlem with diamonds on his wrists and fear in his shadow. The mink coats, the flashy cars, the hidden mansions, all of it was gone. What remained was a frail man in his 80s, sitting in a small house in New Jersey, haunted not by enemies, but by memories. For decades, he had been a symbol of ambition, of genius, of destruction. But now, as the years passed, Frank Lucas had only one thing left: time. Time to think, time to regret, time to wonder if the empire he built had ever been worth the price he paid. In interviews during his later years, his voice carried a tone that was neither pride nor sorrow, but something in between. When he spoke about his rise, there was still a spark in his eyes, a glimmer of the man who once believed he could outthink everyone, even the Mafia. But when the conversation turned to the streets, to the lives lost, the families destroyed by blue magic, his expression would change. The same man who had once justified everything as business now struggled to defend the cost of his empire. "I destroyed a lot of people," he once admitted quietly. "But I destroyed myself too." His reflection was not polished like a movie script. It was messy, human, and filled with contradictions. Frank Lucas was proud of his intelligence, of the empire he had built from nothing. But he also knew that his brilliance had fueled Harlem's darkest era. He had made millions while his own community bled. It was a truth he couldn't escape, no matter how many times he tried to reframe it as survival. In his final years, Lucas often spoke about the illusion of power. "When you have it," he said, "you think you're the only one who ever will. But power don't last. It just moves on to somebody else." He understood that his story was not unique. It was the story of every man who rose too high on the back of other people's pain. Harlem had seen it before, and it would see it again. Despite his crimes, Frank Lucas remained an object of fascination. Hollywood turned his life into a myth with American Gangster, a film that painted him as both a villain and a visionary. To some, he became a symbol of black empowerment, a man who broke free from white, controlled systems and built his own empire. To others, he was nothing more than a glorified criminal, a man who poisoned his own people and then betrayed everyone to save himself. Lucas, however, didn't see himself as either hero or villain. He saw himself as a survivor, a product of a world that offered him no other way out. "People talk about choice," he once said, "but when you grow up with nothing, your choices ain't choices. They're chances. I just took mine further than most." Even in his quiet years, his reputation followed him. Some still feared him. Some wanted to be him. But Frank Lucas had no illusions left. He had seen the cycle, young men dreaming of fast money, the same streets echoing with the same promises. To them, he offered only one message: it don't last. The money, the power, the fear, it all disappears. And when it's gone, what's left of you? Behind those words was the story of a man who had lived both sides of the American dream, the rise and the ruin. He had tasted everything life could offer: power, wealth, respect, and fear. But in the end, he was left with only memories and guilt, the two currencies that never lose value. Frank Lucas's legacy remains divided. To historians, he represents the raw ambition of an era, a time when Harlem's underworld was both an empire and a tragedy. To sociologists, he symbolizes the broken system that allowed crime to thrive while opportunity was denied. And to the streets, he remains an unshakable legend, proof that one man from nothing could take on the world and win, even if that victory came at the cost of everything he loved. In private moments, he mourned the family members lost to the chaos he created. He regretted dragging his wife into a world of violence and excess. He grieved the friends who died protecting his throne. Yet even through that regret, there was no self-pity, only the understanding that this was the price of ambition unchecked. He once said, "You can't build an empire on blood and expect to live clean. Every king's crown comes with ghosts." By the time he passed away in 2019, Frank Lucas's name had long left the headlines, but his story still echoed through history. Not as a warning from a preacher, but as a confession from a man who had lived it. He had walked with power and slept with paranoia. He had fed on loyalty and died with loneliness. And though he had turned his back on the code of the streets never stopped whispering his name. The legend of Frank Lucas is not just about heroin or Harlem. It's about America itself. It's about how a man born into poverty could rise higher than politicians, how intelligence can become corruption, and how success without morality always ends the same way in isolation. His empire proved that control is temporary. His fall proved that consequence is not. As the years fade, Frank Lucas remains frozen between myth and man, a ghost of ambition, both admired and condemned. His story still haunts Harlem's skyline, a reminder that power built on pain always leaves a shadow. In the end, there was no crown, no empire, no applause, just an old man looking back at the kingdom he once ruled and realizing that the true cost of greatness was everything he could never get back.